To understand Easy Street, you have to understand Collingwood in the mid-1970s. It was a working-class suburb of Melbourne, cheap rents, terrace houses jammed shoulder to shoulder, a mix of migrants, students, artists, and young professionals starting out. Front doors were often left unlocked. Neighbors knew each other by first name. It was the kind of place where a scream in the night might be brushed off as an argument, or a stray cat, or nothing at all. Into that suburb in late 1976 moved two young women. Susan Armstrong was 27. She had recently returned from traveling through Greece, and she had come home with a baby boy, Gregory, 16 months old at the time of her death. Susan was described by friends as warm, adventurous, independent, the kind of person who made a room lighter when she walked in. Her flatmate was Susan Bartlett, 28. Sue was a primary school teacher. Quiet, thoughtful, well-liked by her colleagues, deeply invested in her students. She had known Susan for years. When Susan came back to Melbourne with the baby, Sue offered a room. It was meant to be a landing pad, a soft place to start again. The two women moved into 147 Easy Street together in the spring of 1976. By January 1977, they had been living there for only a few months. On Sunday, the 9th of January, they attended a barbecue with friends. Everything about that day was ordinary. Beer, music, conversation about jobs, plans, the summer. Susan left the party first, taking Gregory home. Sue followed later. They both walked back to Easy Street. They both went inside, and here is where the ordinary ended. If this case is already pulling you in, save this video now. You're going to want to come back to the details that come next, because the timeline is what makes this one different, and it is what buried the case for so long. The bodies of Susan Armstrong and Susan Bartlett were discovered on Thursday, the 13th of January, 1977. They had been dead for approximately 3 days. For 72 hours, milk bottles collected on the front step. The mail sat untouched. Nobody knocked. Nobody checked. It was summer, people came and went, and the assumption from friends was simply that Susan and Sue were busy. But inside the house, 16-month-old Gregory was alone. He had been alone the entire time. When friends finally forced entry into the terrace, they found the baby still in his cot, dehydrated, distressed, but alive. Investigators would later describe his survival, given the conditions, as nothing short of a miracle. The scene inside 147 Easy Street was one that hardened Victoria police detectives would refer to, for the rest of their careers, as the worst they had ever attended. Out of respect for the two women and their families, this dossier will not detail the violence. But the case file made 3 things very clear to the investigators who walked through that door in 1977. First, Susan Armstrong had been sexually assaulted. Semen was recovered from the scene. In 1977, this evidence could be typed by blood group and little else, but it was carefully preserved. Second, the killer had spent time inside the house. This was not a fleeting attack. It was not a quick burglary interrupted. The killer had lingered. Third, the killer had left, calmly, apparently unseen, back into the Collingwood night and back into the ordinary life of the city, somewhere, as someone's neighbor, someone's son, someone's friend. The homicide squad launched what would become, at the time, the largest investigation in Victorian history. Hundreds of officers, thousands of interviews, a city on edge, and it went nowhere. In the weeks following the murders, Victoria police pursued every lead they had. They interviewed the barbecue guests. They canvassed every house on Easy Street. They pulled in known offenders across the state. A dedicated task force worked around the clock. Then, roughly a year later, in 1978, a piece of evidence arrived that seemed like it might crack the case. A local teenager, 17 years old at the time of the murders, walked into a police station. He said he had found a knife in the area near Easy Street. He handed it in. That teenager was named, decades later, Perry Couramblis. He lived in the neighborhood. He fit the geography of the crime perfectly. He voluntarily inserted himself into the investigation. In modern policing, all of this would trigger alarms. But in 1978, without physical evidence linking him to the scene, detectives had no legal basis to pursue him further. He was interviewed and released. The knife was never conclusively tied to the murders. The case slid into the cold case files. Years passed, then decades. A reward was posted. It grew and grew again, eventually reaching $1 million Australian dollars, one of the largest ever offered in the state. Meanwhile, forensic science was quietly evolving in ways the 1977 detectives could never have imagined. By the late 1990s, DNA profiling had matured to the point where the biological material preserved from Easy Street could yield a full genetic profile of the offender. Victoria police had it, a complete DNA fingerprint of the killer, sitting in a database. But without a match, a fingerprint is only a shape. It needs a name. In 2017, the Homicide Squad Cold Case Unit made a decisive move. Investigators reviewed the entire case with modern eyes and pulled together a short list of persons of interest whose DNA had never been formally obtained. Perry Couramblis was on that list. They went to speak with him. He was no longer a teenager. He was a middle-aged man, and when police made contact and asked for a DNA sample voluntarily, he left the country. Within a short period, he was in Greece. In Greece, he had citizenship. Under Greek law at the time, extraditing a Greek national to face charges abroad for a decades-old offense was effectively off the table. Victoria police were left with a suspect they now had a legal reason to test and no way to reach him. For 7 more years, the DNA sat in the lab. The man sat in Europe, and 2 families sat with unanswered questions that had by then spanned generations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In September 2024, Perry Couramblis traveled to Italy. That single decision, leaving the safe legal haven of Greece and stepping onto Italian soil, triggered a chain reaction. Italian authorities, acting on an Interpol red notice, arrested him in Rome. Victoria police announced they were seeking extradition. And for the first time, a DNA sample from the man was legally obtained and compared against the profile lifted from 147 Easy Street 47 years earlier. The match was reported to be conclusive. In December 2024, Perry Couramblis was extradited to Australia. He was formally charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of rape. He has since faced Victorian courts where the matter is proceeding. Under Australian law, he is entitled to the presumption of innocence and the charges remain to be tested at trial. But the cold case, the case that hovered over Melbourne for almost 50 years, had, according to police, finally been named. There is a specific kind of question that a case like Easy Street forces us to sit with, not who. That question in this instance may finally be answered by a court. The harder question is, how does a person do this and then live? Because whoever killed Susan Armstrong and Susan Bartlett did not vanish afterwards. They did not turn themselves in. They did not, so far as any evidence suggests, offend at this scale again in a way that came to light. They rejoined the ordinary. They ate breakfast. They held jobs. They spoke to neighbors. They aged. Forensic psychologists who study long-tail cold case offenders describe a category sometimes called the compartmentalizer. Not a serial predator in the pattern-driven, escalation-driven sense. Something arguably more unsettling, an individual capable of committing an act of extreme violence and then partitioning it away, storing it behind a wall of ordinary life so effectively that even people close to them detect nothing. The Easy Street offender profile, developed and refined over decades by Victorian investigators and consulting behaviorists, pointed to someone local. Someone who knew the geography intimately. Someone young, likely in their teens or 20s at the time. Someone whose life afterwards would show no obvious rupture, no dramatic collapse. Someone who, if approached decades later, would present as an unremarkable middle-aged man. That profile, built without a suspect from the evidence alone, is a chilling artifact in its own right, because it describes with uncanny accuracy the kind of person police say they have now charged. There's also a second psychological layer here, and it belongs not to the offender but to the survivors. Gregory Armstrong, the baby in the cot, is now a man in his 40s. He grew up without his mother. He grew up as a living reminder of a case the entire country followed. The families of both women waited nearly half a century for a name. That kind of waiting reshapes people. Grief that cannot resolve becomes something else entirely, a low, permanent hum beneath every ordinary day. Which brings us back to the DNA, because the deepest lesson of Easy Street is not really about one man in Rome. It is about the promise that biology outlasts silence, that a genetic profile preserved in 1977 can wait patiently in a lab drawer for 47 years until the world catches up to it. Every cold case unit in the English-speaking world is watching Easy Street. Every offender still walking free from a 1970s, 80s, or 90s crime scene where biological evidence was collected is mathematically now on a clock. CTA 1213 Min. Cases like this one only get told because people like you stay to the end and take them seriously. If this dossier hit, if you felt that weight, do the 2 things that keep this channel alive. Subscribe and hit the bell icon. New case, new dossier every single day. And if you have ever lived on a street where something happened years before you moved in, or you know a case in your own town that has never been closed, drop it in the comments. I read every one. Some of them become future videos on this channel. Quick question I want you to actually answer below. Do you think a case like Easy Street could have been solved sooner if Australia had mandatory DNA databases the way some countries do? Yes or no? One word is fine. I want to see the split. Outro 1315 Min. Susan Armstrong was 27 years old. Susan Bartlett was 28. They were friends. They were flatmates. One was a mother. One was a teacher. On a summer Sunday in January 1977, they walked home from a barbecue in Collingwood and they never made it back out that door. For 47 years, the city of Melbourne carried them. Detectives who worked the original case retired, some of them passed away, and still the file was kept warm. A $1 million reward was posted. Billboards went up. Anniversaries were marked in the press. And underneath it all, in a police forensic lab, sat the one thing the killer could not take back, his own biology. In 2024, that biology finally spoke. Whether the courts ultimately confirm the police case is now for the Victorian justice system to decide. What is already certain is this: the era in which a killer could disappear into an ordinary life and expect the silence to hold forever is ending. Every year, somewhere in the world, another cold case falls to genetic evidence. Every year, another family gets an answer they had stopped daring to hope for. That is what Easy Street means now, not just a tragedy, a turning point. If this case gripped you, my next dossier walks you through another 1970s cold case that DNA cracked open decades later. Different country, same principle, and a twist in the identification that even seasoned detectives did not see coming. If Easy Street hit, that one will make even more sense now. It is one click away. Until then, stay curious, stay careful, and remember, silence is not the same as safety. Somewhere, another file is waiting for its match. In January 1977, two young women, Susan Armstrong and Susan Bartlett, were found murdered inside their Collingwood terrace at 147 Easy Street, Melbourne. Suzanne's 16-month-old son was found alive in his cot. For 47 years, the case remained one of Australia's most haunting unsolved double homicides, a full DNA profile of the killer sitting in a forensic lab, waiting for a name. In December 2024, after an arrest in Rome and an international extradition, that name was finally attached to the profile. This is the full case dossier, the setup, the crime scene, the investigation, the decades of silence, and the forensic breakthrough that is now reshaping cold case work across the world. Includes the psychological profile of the compartmentalizer offender and what Easy Street means for every unsolved case with preserved biological evidence. 0000, the hook 00, 30 Melbourne, January 1977, 02, 00 Susan and Sue 04, 00 what happened at 147 Easy Street 06, 00 47 years of silence 09, 00 the psychology of the compartmentalizer 12, 00 why this case changes cold case work forever 13, 00 final thoughts, subscribe and hit the bell. A new case every day on CrimeDossier. True crime cold case Easy Street DNA evidence criminal psychology.